I'd just like to interject for a moment. What you're referring to as Linux is, in fact, GNU Linux, or as I've recently taken to calling it, GNU plus Linux. Linux is not an operating system unto itself, but rather another free component of a fully functioning new system made useful by the new corelibs. Shell utilities and vital system components comprising a full OS as defined by a POSS. Many computer users run a modified version of the GNU system every day, without realizing it. Through a peculiar turn of events, the version of GNU, which is widely used today, is often called Linux. There really is a Linux, and these people are using it, but it is just a part of the system they use. The kernel is an essential part of an operating system, but useless by itself. It can only function in the context of a complete operating system. Linux is normally used in combination with the GNU operating system. The whole system is basically GNU with Linux added, or GNU Linux. All the so-called Linux distributions are really distributions of GNU Linux.
No, engineer, it's Linux, not GNU Linux. The most important contributions that they've made to Linux were the creation of the GNU compiler. Those are fine and inspired products. This is a monumental achievement and has earned you, or earns, and the Free Software Foundation countless kudos and much appreciation. Following are some reasons for you to mull over, including some already answered in your FAQ. One day, Linus Torvalds used Git to make his operating system. Yes, Linux is an us. More on this later. He named it Linux with a little help from his friends. Why doesn't he call it GNU/Linux? Because he wrote it with more help from his friends, not you. You named your stuff. What? I named my stuff, including the software I wrote using the CC, and Linus named his stuff. The proper name is Linux because Linus Torvalds says so. Linus has spoken. Accept his authority. To do otherwise is to become a nag. You don't want to be known as a nag, do you? An operating system does not equal a distribution. Linux is an operating system. By my definition, an operating system is that software which provides and limits access to hardware resources on a computer. That definition applies wherever you see Linux in use. However, Linux is usually distributed with a collection of utilities and applications to make it easily configurable as a desktop system. A server, a development box, or a graphics workstation, or whatever the user needs. In such a configuration, we have a Linux-based distribution. Therein lies your strongest argument for the unwieldy title. GNU/Linux, when said bundled software, is largely from Linux. Go bug the distribution makers on that one. Take your beef to Red Hat, Mandrake, and Slackware. At least there you have an argument. Linux alone is an operating system that can be used in various applications without any GNU software whatsoever. Embedded applications come to mind as an obvious example. Next, even if we limit the GNU/Linux title to the GNU-based Linux distributions, we run into another obvious problem. x386 may well be more important to a particular Linux installation than the sum of all the GNU contributions. More properly, shouldn't the distribution be called x386/Linux? Or, at a minimum, x386/GNU/Linux? Of course, it would be rather arbitrary to draw the line there when many other fine contributions go unlisted. Yes, I know you've heard this one before. Get used to it. You'll keep hearing it until you can cleanly counter it. You seem to like the lines of code metric. There are many lines of GNU code in a typical Linux distribution. You seem to suggest that more LOC equals more important. However, I submit to you that raw LOC numbers do not directly correlate with importance. I would suggest that CLOCK cycles spent on code is a better metric. For example, if my system spends 90% of its time executing x386 code, x386 is probably the single most important collection of code on my system. Obviously, this metric isn't perfect either, but LOC really sucks. Please refrain from using it ever again in supporting any argument. Last, I'd like to point out that we Linux and GNU users shouldn't be fighting among ourselves over naming other people's software.
Loser.
But what the heck, I'm in a bad mood now. I think I'm feeling sufficiently obnoxious to make the point that GCC is so very famous and, yes, so very useful only because Linux was developed. In a show of proper respect and gratitude, shouldn't you and everyone refer to GCC as the Linux compiler, or at least Linux GCC? Seriously, where would your masterpiece be without Linux, languishing with the herd? If there is a moral buried in this rant, maybe it is this. Be grateful for your abilities and your incredible success and your considerable fame. You RMS, the Free Software Foundation, and the software have reached their current high profile largely on the back of Linux. You have changed the world. Now, go forth and don't be a nag. Thanks for listening.